Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode, we have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on architecture and architectural thinking. We are interested in what architecture is today, what it has been in the past, and what it might be, what it could be in the future. Today I have with me my old friend Mark Jarzombek, who's Professor of History and Theory at MIT, and he's the author of so many books I cannot list them. But most recently, he has just done an amazing module in the GAHTC collective on First Societies, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, welcome to Architecture Talk, Mark.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to your conversation.
That's great, Mark. And I just wanted to also note that, of course, this module follows up on a textbook that you recently published on the architecture of First Societies. So I think a good place might be to begin would be to ask you, what do you mean by First Societies?
Good question. It's, let's say, a little bit ambiguous and open-ended because it implies maybe second societies or third societies. As I explained in the introduction to the book, I didn't want to use the concept hunter-gatherer because that emphasizes food processing and that people are starving and that all they're obsessed about is food. I didn't want to use forager, which is a dismissive word. I certainly didn't want to use primitive. So there was some problem as to what kind of abstraction one could use in order to sort of look at all of this. I was interested in emphasizing the social aspect, that the modern human, as we understand it, emerged, yes, when we started making fire, and yes, when we started making tools, and all of these things that we're familiar with. But my argument was I'm more interested in when we started becoming social animals. And so maybe not animals is the wrong word here, but social creatures. And so when we became societies, and the sociability of the human is itself an important aspect of who we are, just as it is as tool making and fire and eating and so forth. So the first chapter sort of ends with the dance ceremonialism, which for me was just as an important development in the human cognitive world as sharpening a flint blade.
I see. So you are trying to distinguish sort of socius, or the building of society, from particularly things like tool building or city building or significant dwelling building, which is normally considered to be the starting point of quote-unquote civilization. Is that the point here?
Yes, I would say that's the point. In other words, the model might be we first make tools, and then with tools we chop down wood, and with wood we then make houses and so forth. Whereas in the anthropological viewpoint, we, of course, at some moment make tools, but the first huts had nothing to do with shelter. They were, we don't really know, of course, but we started making huts at least 200,000 BC. But if we look back through the anthropological present to the foggy past, it's probably unlikely that shelter itself had a lot to do with it. The huts were made as sort of symbols of social unity, often around fires. You danced around the fires and things like that. So the architecture may have had nothing to do with shelter, right? The Dakung people built huts, but they don't really live in the huts. The huts are just sort of there. They're just sort of place markers for their particular group. So I'm trying to get away from the instrumentalization of cognition, that we're basically mini industrialists. The idea that we're tool makers came out in the 19th century during the Victorian era, during the height of industrialization. And so it was clear that if you're in late 19th century, you're industrialized, you're looking to man as a tool maker.
Right. And architecture as the product of a tool-making thinking process.
Exactly.
So instead, what I gather from you, you're trying to emphasize and therefore identify an alternative genesis to what we call architecture, which is simply as a marker of the production of society versus an instrumental definition. Yes.
If we see it as, we first start primitive and then we get more sophisticated. Actually, the first huts were pretty sophisticated things. You had to bend and shape wood branches in a particular way. You had to use particular types of grasses and reeds. They had to be dried in a particular way. The leaves had to be, good leaves had to be found and laid out and used. As the leaves dried, they had to be replaced because they were crackly, and all of these things. So the construction, fabrication, and all of this was done almost certainly by women.
Yes.
So the tools we associate with men. The men go out hunting with their tools, and the women stay at home doing what? No one really knows. But they're, staying at home making huts.
Right. So that's interesting. So there are two kind of radical alternative, in a sense, readings of architecture here. One is the idea that there isn't necessarily a progress in civilization as time goes on, which is that I think you're trying to make the argument that societies were always sophisticated, always cultured, always complex in some ways. And in part, this lack of recognition of the persistent sophistication of society is a consequence of a perspective which privileges what is traditionally kind of a male point of view in the world. Is that kind of what the argument you're trying to make?
Absolutely, yeah. I think we have this sort of idea that there is a sort of a male rationalism where after they made tools, somebody stood up and it started to rain, and then they said, oh my God, it's raining, let's make a shelter.
Right.
And this argument, which comes out of the Renaissance, is sort of historical nonsense.
Why do you call it nonsense versus, let's say, a different perspective? Or is it sort of hegemonic in some way?
There's so little. I mean, if we understand the anthropological record, which is, it's very difficult to take use the current first societies that have survived all these millennia today and look backward in time. But if we sort of shadow that backward, we realize that the Dakung people didn't make huts for shelter. That's not what they did.
Mm-hmm.
Shelter as such, comes out when you had nomadic people, going along the deserts trading. They needed, advanced and sophisticated sort of shelter mechanisms.
Right.
But here, most people lived in the outdoors. They lived in the open. So it rained a little bit, didn't bother them too much. So it wasn't a consciousness arising moment where someone all of a sudden discovered that it's raining. That wasn't what drove people to make these huts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, it may be a part of the story, but to sort of instrumentalize a type of emerging rationalism that shelter produces a type of efficacy of materials, that's hard to sort of see that as the driver, right? My argument is that the efficacy comes in the social networking. When you have a social networking, the huts become an extension of social networking. They define a space where you dance, where you eat, where you butcher material here and not there, where you cook here and not there, where you produce. Also, the huts allow identification of the scale of these early band formations. These early band formations, the scale of which they function, was maybe around 20 people or so. So you'd have maybe 10 huts, or anywhere between 2 or 3 to 10 huts and so forth. And that's about it. So what architecture allowed was a type of visualization of the scale of the band. But you're not going to have 100 huts clustered together. So they come in very specific scaled things. The anthropological term is budding.
Budding?
Budding, like a flower. So the bud, will develop, and then if it's more than a group can handle, they'll just go off down the valley or up the valley or into the next valley and make another sort of bud, and so forth and so on. And it's extremely beautiful in its survivability ratio, because if something happens to one valley, the other valley can keep it on. There's very little density.
Okay, so the question becomes, Mark, one is to trace the teleology of the 19th century technologist fellow-centric model. We trace a kind of trajectory which then, ends up celebrating in the end, whatever it is, Renzo Piano, Santiago Calatrava, or sort of a handcrafted technological making of contemporary architecture. I mean, can we run a parallel or alternative trajectory, if not teleology, for what you are talking about, and identify what you would consider to be interesting architectures today?
I would say there's a problem with that. I mean, as much as I would love that, I would say we encounter a problem, but it's sort of a good problem.
Right.
That world was, without doubt, what we would call today animist. So if you wanted to chop down a tree, you had to ask the tree permission.
Right.
If you wanted to move a rock, you had to ask the rock its permission. Right? Everything, the entire natural world was filled with vortexes of aliveness to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these are still residually present today. So when the Ise shrine gets built in Japan, the Shinto priests have to go out to the forest and they have to perform the ceremony where they're asking tree permission to be cut.
Right. And when we built our house in Chandigarh in India, I remember, things were placed in the foundations, sacrifices were made into the foundations of the foundation.
Today, we don't teach this in architecture school. And if you teach in architecture school, you'll be thought as you wouldn't get tenure, right?
I guess so.
We don't ask the ore in the mountain if it wants to become steel.
We ask a brick what it wants to be.
We can do that. We can do that. That's we can ask the brick maybe what it wants to be, but we know the brick basically doesn't really care. But the tree might care, right? The tree might.
Right. Well, isn't that ecological thinking? Isn't that what ecology is about? Asking the tree where its permission to be cut?
Yeah, if we sort of update it, if you want to think of that updated sort of scenario, ecology, wouldn't be about carbon neutralness, right? Or it wouldn't be a rational metrical thing. It would have to be a conversation that we would have with materials.
Right.
That would be different, because we don't have conversations about materials, right? We just measure the material. The material is a dead object.
Right.
What would it mean to ask a clump of sand if it's okay for it to join some cement to become concrete?
Right. So it wouldn't be the sort of green index of the carbon emissions of materials, not the sort of abstract dead data that is important. It's a more sort of interpersonal relationship with the environment. We are having a conversation with Mark Jarzombek, and we are discussing the architecture of first societies. Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and we are in the middle of a conversation with Mark Jarzombek on the architecture of first societies. So, Mark, I thought a good question might be that in, I think, your third lecture, you note that in Malta, the first time made models from which architecture was made. And in your lecture notes, you said that this is when architecture begins. What did you mean by that?
Okay. So subtext to this is there's a lot of discussion in the sort of the popular culture and in the architectural studio about when does architecture begin?
Right.
And so instead of saying it begins with shelter or it begins with other things, I thought, why not say that it really begins when we start making models? And this happens extremely early in what we might call in the domain of architecture. So Malta, we don't know when these little models were made. Let's say 3,500 BC, perhaps earlier. And we have not only the actual models, the models are small, the size of matchboxes, but we also have drawings on the walls, carved into the stone of the walls of some of the temples. So we know that they only also drew the facade type of elevation. So one of the reasons we know what they look like is because they made a model and they made a sketch or drawing of these things from the side. So, you think sort of primitive people, how would they draw a building? They might draw it in a funny, as a blob or something. But these are actually pretty precise. There's like an elevation, and you can see there's the ground plane, and then there's the wall, the stones, and then there's the sort of the dome of the mound, cumulus mound over it. And the same thing with the model. It's very small, size of a matchbox, but beautifully incised, and you can get a sense there's the door, there's a mound, and so forth. So this sort of means that there's a strong consciousness about the shape of the building, about its dimensionality, and also about the idea that it's, in the case of the Malta temples, these are portable devices. So the stone was certainly sacred. So it wasn't just a model as we might imagine it sort of in cardboard, but it was a little piece of the flesh of the building itself that you would carry with you. And how that worked, we don't really know. The going argument is that it's something like when you go to Paris and you buy a little gizmo that looks like the Eiffel Tower and, put on your keychain. So these were clearly things you travel with. Malta was a small island. You had 15 to 20 temples, way too many temples for the people that lived on the island. So clearly Malta was a destination, a type of spiritual destination. People would get there on their rowboats or paddle boats or however they got there for some spiritual ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea is, well, then when you finished your dream sequence in the temple and you were probably wealthy enough, you would get as a token of your participation or your presence there one of these models, and then you go back home. And when you got back home to wherever you were in France or Italy or Greece, whatever, you could say, listen, this comes from Malta, right? And so they had spiritual or talismanic powers.
I see.
So this is a way to understand architecture that's sort of outside of the idea of its functionality or for its program or its material beginnings, but as a mnemonic device. So I think that's a very powerful reason to say that's when architecture begins.
So it's not so much the argument that the models were used in the modern sense as a three-dimensional graphics scaled down from which the larger scale object is made. It's more the model as in a scalar possession of the main building which can be transported and taken away and thus participate in the production of society.
Correct. Where we have to see the model as not as a diminished form of the architecture or as a pre-architectural thing, but actually as part of the architecture. In the same way that a Hindu temple can be a model of a mountain. It's a very big model, but it's from the scale of the mountain, it's small. So the scale of it doesn't mean it's less powerful. It still is architecture in a very real and visceral sense. It's hard to describe because it's small and the architecture is big. We call it a model. But in some sense, the temples in Malta would themselves be models.
Right. So the models themselves are architecture, yes?
That's right.
But I want to return back to this idea of, what is architecture? And if architecture is modeling at various different scales, where there is no there is no authentic or there is no original at any level, right? They are all models of each other. So that moves architecture into two discussions. One is architecture becomes then almost entirely a network of signification. And second, architecture becomes a process of self-formation as mimicry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Modeling, to use my favorite set of references, is exactly the purpose also in some ways of wearing clothes or wearing masks on your face. You are trying to model yourself into something else.
Yes.
So in that sense, all of making architecture is like acting in a play. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Theater. It's always a production of theater.
I see where you're going with this, and I like it. We have to just remember theater isn't what happens in a building, but it's a theatricalicity or something.
To live is to be on the stage, as my friend William Shakespeare put it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with that. I think that the relationship between this architecture, which is modeling itself at various scales, from the invisible, the invisible mountain,
mm-hmm.
to the real mountain, to the artificial mountain, to a little bitty piece of a mountain that's in your pocket, only happens in the context where the human social world is the glue that puts it all together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the relationships that are bound up between that, yes, are a series of maskings or presencings and absencings. There's always something absent to every model.
Right. You brought up the reference to Eiffel Tower, so it's a perfect segue into Roland Barthes' reading of the Eiffel Tower as pure semiotics, right?
Yes.
Are you happy to link what you are saying to Roland Barthes' production of architecture in the networks of semiotics?
Just off the cuff, I would say the arrows would point towards a yes on that. Because that's just, as opposed to a more modernist orientation, which I would not want.
Modernist in the sense of form follows function.
Form follows function, or that we have building and ritual.
Your textbook is almost 600, 700 pages long. It makes its way through a wide range of examples and cultures and locations and architectures. In doing this work and thinking about it in reflection, do you have a favorite amongst them in some ways? Is there something that moved you particularly?
I do. It's a story of the pit house.
Mm-hmm.
It starts in Japan, clearly 10,000 BC or something like that. Also in eastern China, we see it in Banpo, 5,000 BC. So it's that neck of the woods. Also in Siberia, the hunters there, maybe even earlier, maybe 10 or 15,000 BC, we see sort of clearly look like pit houses. And the track of the pit house up around the Pacific, down the Pacific into Canada, down Canada into New Mexico and Arizona, and then to the southwest, is a track that goes from, let's say, 15,000 BC to 1700. To the arrival of the white man.
Uh-huh.
This is an amazing trajectory. It's the longest and most ancient form of architecture we've ever produced. So 15,000 plus years long. It is extremely ingenious in how and why it gets made. It's extremely resilient, an amazing thing. And so the social energy that it takes to produce a pit house, the reasons for them, their orientation, and so forth and so on, is a story not just of quote-unquote tradition and longevity and a type of resistance to other types of changes because they change in small ways, But it's a global story because it crosses Asia into Japan. I mean, no, it's today the scholarship will look at a pit house in the Jomon, it'll look at pit house among the Yupik Indians, it'll look at pit houses on the Navajo.
Yeah.
But believe it or not, there's only one article, a very small article, that says, wow, these things could be connected. And that's just the astonishing thing. Of course they're connected.
Right.
But we end with that narrative. We don't begin with that. So if we actually begin with the fact that they're connected, then we could look at the Jomon pit house slightly differently because we know a lot about the Navajo pit house because these people were around until the 19th century and so forth. So, and they were we know how they made them, why they made them. We know the symbolic landscape and so forth like that. And that helps us understand the Jomon, so about which we know nothing except the holes in the ground. It helps us to see these really cross-temporal, cross-geographic trajectories, which are, very astonishing to reflect upon.
Yeah, and it creates the contemporary discussion of where the chthonic is, and there is a culture of some underground using the earth to make dwellings. In China, there is a lot of this, I know still.
Yes.
And there is the sort of whole stepwell culture in India.
It resonates deeply into all sorts of various practices. But unfortunately, we call them pit houses because in the 19th century, the people came to these things and they looked like pits. And so we give them basically a bad name.
Right.
But it's not my role really to necessarily try to coin a different name. We're stuck with the name. Archaeologists call them pit houses. But they're really not pits. The Haida house in the northwest of Canada, these are pit houses, yes, but these are the McMansions of pit houses. These are fantastic things, right? It's a double pit. They're huge, right? They're 50 feet by 50 feet square. These are not pits. These are basically symbolic spaces of extreme importance.
There's the pit house, and then there is the piloti, which sort of rises above the ground, kind of is this antithesis, I guess, which comes more from granaries and the need to sort of elevate grain above the ground, right?
Yeah, the marsh. That's right.
Anyway, it was great to talk to you, Mark. Thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
It was my pleasure, and I wish you all the best in this.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. I'm Vikram Prakash, and our show's producer is Sadie Vechler. See you next time.